The Douglas B-66 destroyer was a highly valuable asset during the Vietnam War. Built during the 1950s, the aircraft would eventually become a productive support aircraft, and a very versatile one at that. The destroyer was initially based on the Douglas A-3 Skywarrior, but its design eventually evolved to a mostly original model as several requirements kept coming from the US Navy. Despite its moniker, the destroyer served most notably as an electronic countermeasures aircraft, guiding several bombing strikes in North Vietnam. In 1972, when the US troops were being withdrawn from the South Asian conflict, the enemy strategically targeted several top officers. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel Icel Hambleton, who on April 2nd volunteered as a navigator aboard an EB-66C and was the only crew member to survive when the aircraft met unexpected ground fire during the most formidable North Vietnamese strike of the entire war. Redesigning an aircraft. Before the era of satellites and drones, the US Air Force relied only on aircraft for air surveillance. As such, the need for a lighter land-based airship was needed, and the US Navy used the heavy carrier-based A-3 Skywarrior as a starting point. When negative claims about the A-3's performance were validated and pressure was mounting because of the Korean War, the US Air Force decided to develop a variant. The objective was to replace the obsolete Douglas A-26 Invader with this new aircraft, which would serve as a light tactical bomber. The process initially entailed a simple conversion from the Skywarrior into a land-based, denavalized model, stripped of all carrier-specific features. Hence, no prototypes were needed. The Air Force then acquired 5 pre-production models being developed by the Navy, but the initial plans evolved when the Air Force determined that this aircraft needed to carry out low-level nuclear strikes, as opposed to high-altitude ones like its predecessor. As a result, the Skywarrior's J-57 turbojet engines were swapped for 2 Allison J-71s, a modification that demanded a complete redesign of the power systems, repositioning the hydraulic pumps and generators onto the engines, while no longer being fed bleed air from within the fuselage. Other changes included a different pressurized crew compartment structure, landing gear, and even door geometry. The fuselage and wing were designed from scratch. Aviation authors Bill Gunston and Peter Gilchrist observed that, quote, "The history of the aviation is sprinkled with aircraft which, to save money, were intended to be merely a modified version of an existing type. In very few cases, it actually happened like this. The B-66 is a classic example. The destroyer had 10,200 pounds of thrust, which translated to a maximum speed of 585 miles per hour. Its cruise speed was 525 miles per hour. Its range was 1,800 miles, and its ceiling reached 43,000 feet. As for armament, it was fitted with 2 20mm cannons in the tail, and its internal bomb bay could carry 15,000 pounds of weaponry, while Gunston and Gilchrist thought that, quote, 98% of the changes introduced in the RB-66A were unnecessary. The new ejection seats added to the B-66's design would save many lives in the future. Operational history. The Douglas B-66 destroyer flew its maiden flight on June 28, 1954. The first 5 pre-production RB-66As significantly contributed to improvements in the production aircraft, and by January of 1955, the first production model, B-66B, was already flying, with deliveries commencing roughly a year later. After being introduced in 1956, a total of 254 destroyers were produced with different configurations. Despite its haunting moniker, the first batch of 145 RB-66Bs was actually a photo reconnaissance version with a crew of 3. Many models served in tactical reconnaissance squadrons in the United Kingdom and West Germany, and a total of 13 B models were eventually modified to electronic countermeasures aircraft, labeled EB-66Bs. The B model then branched into the RB-66C, the first of which was explicitly designed from the onset for electronic intelligence missions. It featured additional specialized equipment and housed 4 extra crew members in the former bomb bay, now a work area. The C model was outfitted with distinctive wing pods to accommodate receiver antennas, similarly to the belly-mounted blister. Only 36 of this version were produced, several of which operated near Cuba during the missile crisis and were later deployed to Vietnam. By 1966, they were redesignated EB-66C. Another version developed by the Air Force was a weather reconnaissance model, the WB-66D, which would inspire the Northrop X-21 variant with an experimental wing. However, the WB-66D didn't have such a crucial impact as the ECM B-66. This version played a key role in strikes against North Vietnam, detecting enemy radar emissions and providing invaluable data on enemy positions. Moreover, the aircraft could jam the enemy's signals and confuse their defenses. Some models were even used as pathfinders, guiding bombing strikes through rough weather. The unarmed B-66 variants flew several missions during the Vietnam War, gathering electronic intelligence, providing protection for bombing missions and flying oval patterns over North Vietnam. But when a B-66 was shot down by a MiG, the aircraft were deemed too vulnerable and consequently ordered to fly outside enemy airspace. The last B-66s would be retired in 1975. Trawler. 3 years before the B-66 destroyers were retired, one particular mission, led by expert navigator Lieutenant Colonel Icel Hambleton, would become the most expensive air rescue operation of the entire war. During the Easter offensive launched by North Vietnam against their southern counterparts on March 30th, 1972, a large concentration of anti-aircraft weaponry, supported by 2 tank regiments of 150 Soviet tanks and the North Vietnamese army, covered the area between the Cam Lo and Dong Ha bridges. News of the unexpected movement south of the demilitarized zone reached the American headquarters in Saigon, and on April 2nd, Hambleton volunteered to board an EB-66C and gather signals intelligence, while a newer version, the EB-66E, would jam surface-to-air radar guidance systems. The destroyer's task was to troll the missiles by performing a maneuver known as the SAM break, in which the aircraft would do a quick dive past the rising missile, followed by a violent pull-up and change of direction. This dangerous feat had been used hundreds of times during the war. Bat-21 and Bat-22 were the call signs for the 2 EB-66s from the 42nd Tactical Electronic Warfare Squadron, and they were escorted by 3 B-52s, tasked to bomb Mu Gia. But when the squadron reached the south of the demilitarized zone, they were met by unexpected anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles, or SAM. The destroyers managed to thwart the first volley of missiles, but 2 more SAMs were then fired optically, delaying the targeted aircraft's response. By the time the guidance systems were turned on, it was too late for Bat-21 to dodge the missile, and the pilot ordered the crew to eject. The navigator, Lieutenant Colonel Hambleton, was the only one to launch before the second missile tore the EB-66C apart. The survivor was seen landing safely and immediately sent his distress signal. However, he landed among tens of thousands of North Vietnamese elements. The 53-year-old navigator had invaluable knowledge and classified information, and was one of the most knowledgeable missile and electronic countermeasures professionals still in Vietnam, so it became a priority to rescue him before he was captured and taken to Hanoi with the Soviets. Hambleton was wounded from the explosion and ejection, but with 9 months left for his retirement, he was determined to return home. Search and rescue aircraft came to his aid, but the pilots were received by ground fire so intense that it was only comparable to anti-aircraft fire around Hanoi. This attack would become the most significant combined armed confrontation by the North Vietnamese during the war. Hambleton himself would eventually guide the airstrikes from the ground, aiming at nearby enemies and correctly calculating their positions. It is said that the lieutenant always remained calm and centered, even under life-threatening circumstances. But trying to rescue the navigator cost the Air Force 5 aircraft, 11 men, and 2 captures. The Stars and Stripes magazine described the operation as, quote, the biggest U.S. air rescue effort of the war. In addition, a no-fire zone within 17 miles of his position was enforced, which indirectly cost the lives of thousands of South Vietnamese who were deprived of air support and artillery. 5 days after Hambleton was downed, it was clear that an air rescue would not be possible. Navy SEAL Thomas R. Norris, one of only 3 SEAL officers remaining in the country, was then dispatched to get Hambleton, accompanied by South Vietnamese Nguyen Van Kiet. Knowing that their communications were being monitored, Hambleton was given directions in code using golf terms. Quote, you're going to play 18 holes, and you're going to get in the Swanee and make like Esther Williams and Charlie the Tuna. The round starts on number 1 at Tucson National. His first thought was, quote, what have you been smoking? But he figured out his rescuers were using his broad knowledge of golf and golf courses. As he moved towards a water body, Norris and Nguyen, disguised as fishermen, rowed to his rescue. Hambleton was dehydrated, fatigued, and hadn't eaten in over a week. He couldn't continue when he found the water obstacle and simply laid down, waiting to be rescued. Finally, the SEAL officer and the South Vietnamese commando got to him and carried him back home. For this feat, Norris was awarded the Medal of Honor, and Nguyen was given the Navy Cross, the only South Vietnamese sailor who earned it during the war.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to fly the F-16 for 13 years, and I flew the F-15C for about a year. Those are great platforms. They do a great job, and they're a lot of fun to fly. But having flown this now for about a year and a half, I'll tell you, I enjoy flying this aircraft out of all three of them much, much better. The performance, it's a large airplane. It's a little bit heavier than an F-15, but it performs like the F-16. I mean, it'll turn on a dime, and it just handles like a dream. In the Raptor, what happens is it takes in all these signals, and it does all the calculation for you and displays it in one display. So you look down at that display, and it displays the battle space for you. So you spend more time, instead of worrying about what the battle space looks like, what your next move is, because you know what the battle space looks like. The jet tells you that. So I would say this jet is much more easy to employ weapons than any other aircraft I've ever flown. I started flying out in Cessnas in Gainesville, Florida, in Cessna 172s and 152s. And after I got in the Air Force, I got so busy that I kind of let my license kind of slip a little bit there. But a couple years back, when I was down at Maxwell Air Force Base assigned there, I went ahead and got my license back up to speed. And that way I could take my family up and take my wife and my kids up and let them fly around a little bit in an aircraft. So I still love to go up in the Cessnas. I still have a blast in them. I just love to fly. It is an absolute thrill to fly this jet. This jet handles like a dream. So when you have the opportunity to actually take this thing off and fly it, I feel lucky every time I just get to sit in a seat and go fly. It's just an exciting day for me to go to work. It is a very, what we call user-friendly airplane. It's very easy to fly. Now, employing it as a weapon system, that's a little bit different. That takes some training, and it takes a lot of hard practice and work to get good at that. I really want these folks to understand what this airplane's about and let them make their own judgments about what they see in this aircraft and what they hear from the guys that maintain it and from the guys that operate it. If they hear the truth, it'll sell itself, because this jet is that revolutionary and that significant to our forces that I want them to understand this, and this is their aircraft. We're just the lucky souls that get to go out and fly it every day for them, but this aircraft is made to protect them. They pay for it, and I want them to understand what a good weapon system they've bought here. Cat. You can always find out more information about the team by going to our website at leapfrog.navy.mil. Following today's jump, the Navy Parachute team will be available to answer any questions you might have about the special warfare community or the Navy in general. Feel free to stop and ask any questions at any time to any of our jumpers. All right, as our last two jumpers make their way into the zone at any time without the proper training. High up overhead, you see two of our jumpers that move together in what we call a biplane formation. That's when two jumpers move their canopies next to each other, then a top jumper will hook into the end of the lower jumper's riser. In effect, it will look like that top jumper is standing on the lower jumper's shoulders. From that basic biplane, the jumpers can do various other formations, such as the two jumpers that have trailing for give weight. All right, those two jumpers I just told you about in the side-by-side formation are now coming down in that downplane at 60 miles per hour, directly at the ground. As soon as safety permits, they will break apart, drive away, and make their own safe entry into the area.
Nobody else in the world has seen them the first time or the second time. So we're fond of saying it takes a B-1B Lancer and to the bone.
I have a B-1 that is taking up a tremendous amount of room, so you've got to use a lot of caution out there.
Seen by Beach Place, if you know where that is. Been missing for about 45 minutes. You can imagine the panic that Alex Martinez had and his parents. And the concern you see as an American. When you look around, when you pick up an attitude down at 15 miles in Iraq, passing out to down out to Space Shuttle. Where are you being concerned on Recon or Richmond Town or Houston and Inland? I-20 hit the car. Leading man wasn't for where's their line and do anything to get them to take it. Doing it good again, not to climb in the water.
1
I guess I was fairly apprehensive the whole time that I was flying in combat. And I guess there's good reason to feel that way. I'm there to cause a lot of damage and a lot of harm, and therefore they would like to damage me. And I was 25 years old at that time. Now, one of the things that my dad had done when he was teaching me how to fly, and I've been very fond of saying, if I have been successful as an aviator, it's because he was the one that taught me how to fly. He didn't just teach me how to fly, he taught me the why of it at the same time. So he was telling me the engineering, he was telling me the structural ramifications of pulling G's, for example, and how airplanes fly. So that was a great start. But then, having the aeronautical engineering degree where you learned about profile drag and induced drag and shockwave drag, transonic drag, all of those things, I'm convinced that made me better prepared to learn how to fly in the Navy when it was time to go through Navy pilot training. So I had not a whole lot of flight experience. I had about 150 hours of flight time before I joined the Navy. But between that and the aeronautical engineering, I had a huge head start.
Why Navy?
Well, the story of how I wound up in the Navy was a little bit complicated because back in the late 1960s, we had the Vietnam conflict going on. And so the draft was something that was going on.
The Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 created the first peacetime draft in American history. Used to fill the ranks during World War II, it was eventually replaced by the Selective Service Act of 1948. Although modified at times, the Selective Service Act remained in effect through the start of the Vietnam War. During the Vietnam War, the draft became a hotly contested issue. Anti-draft demonstrations on college campuses erupted throughout the nation.
You were only going to have 4 years of college deferment that you could have. And since I transferred from a community college into the 4-year university system, I was out of sequence in one course. It was going to take 5 years to graduate. And so at the end of my 3rd year, beginning of my 4th year, I had to fill out a questionnaire if I was going to graduate in 4 years, and the answer was no. And so immediately the draft came after me, and they were going to draft me out of college, right out of college. And so I figured I'd better go sign up for an officer program because I wanted to fly jet fighters. And the first place I went to, I walked into the Air Force recruiter, and the Air Force recruiter said, "Well, when are you going to graduate?" And I said, "Well, that's the problem. I'm not going to." And he said, "Well, we don't talk to candidates unless you're within 6 months of graduation. So come back a year from now or a year and a half from now." Well, there wasn't going to be a year from now. And so I walked into the Navy recruiter, and the first question was, what's your draft status? And I said, it's 1A. And he pulls out this form letter that says, "Dear Draft Board, please leave this guy alone. We're considering him for an officer program." And he signs it at the bottom, and he said, "Sign here. This gives us 3 months to work this." And I signed there, so immediately I was impressed. And so that's the story of why I wound up in the Navy instead of in the Air Force. And I'm glad it went that way, because I got to have the experience of flying from aircraft carriers, which is a very unique part of aviation. And I would have missed it, most likely, if I'd been in the Air Force. So that was a lucky break. And so I'm proud of the fact that I did get to be a naval officer and serve in the military for altogether 27 years.
Wow. Can you kind of summarize the Navy experience up to the time you got your wings?
Well, I'm sure we've all heard the expression boot camp. It wasn't called boot camp, but it was just like boot camp. You had Marine Corps drill instructors screaming at you, urging you along. And if you were pretty thin-skinned, it was going to be a difficult thing for you to do. But it was called, in my case, it was Aviation Officer Candidate School. And it was, it was about 16 weeks that you went through it. And that was basically learning how to be an officer, learning how to be a member of the military, and learning how to be an officer. But it also included primary flight training, which was great. So I got to fly the Beechcraft T-34B Mentor, which is a Bonanza with 2 seats, a tandem cockpit, but it was same engine as the early Bonanzas, same wing, same fuselage structure for the most part. And I got to fly that. That took about 7 weeks to get through the course of instruction. And you wound up soloing the T-34. Of course, I had soloed previously to that and had my private license prior to that. But I got to do that, and that was the course of instruction. And at the very end of it, on the day that you were commissioned, graduated and commissioned from Aviation Officer Candidate School, that same drill instructor that had been screaming at you all those weeks of your training, all of a sudden he was your first salute. And so he got to be the one who rendered your first salute to you. And that was Staff Sergeant Sanders was my drill instructor. Never forget him.
Never forgot.
Never forget.
In the training portion of your Navy career, leading up to getting your wings, what did you learn that you didn't know before you started the Navy program about flying?
Oh, so many things. Of course, I had flown general aviation aircraft, and so that was the same as primary flight training. Everything beyond that was much more advanced. I had never flown a jet airplane until I went to the T-2A Buckeye, North American T-2A Buckeye, and that was the first jet that I ever flew. And jet aviation is so very much different from piston engines or even just propeller-type aircraft. Not just the speeds involved, but the altitudes involved, the flight envelopes, the G-loading that you're able to put on those kind of airplanes. So it's much more high-speed flight, much more dynamics. There's a whole lot more flight dynamics involved, because if you picture something like, let's say, the difference between a J3 Piper Cub, which is much aerodynamics, very little vehicle dynamics because the vehicle mass is so light. Now, contrast that with something like an F-104 Starfighter, which I've flown, which has these little tiny wings, a lot of mass in the fuselage, a lot of inertia, a lot of momentum that can be built up with pitch rates and roll rates and things like that. There's so much in the world of dynamics and maybe not quite so much aerodynamics. And so there was a lot to learn about the flight dynamics of big, heavy airplanes as being different from very light airplanes.
So what year did you receive your wings, and then when you were ready to go to the fleet, where did you go first?
I was pinned on my wings on January the 29th, 1971 at Corpus Christi. I had finished advanced jet training actually at Kingsville Naval Air Station, but the ceremony with the Admiral took place at Corpus Christi, Naval Air Station Corpus Christi. So I received my wings that day, and I had orders to report to Miramar Naval Air Station in San Diego to train to fly the F-4 Phantom. And that had been my first choice. My first choice. You filled out a preference card when you were within, I don't know, pick a number, 3 months of receiving your wings. And my first choice had been F-4 Phantoms on the West Coast. And second choice was F-8 Crusaders on the West Coast. And then third choice would have been F-4 Phantoms on the East Coast and F-8 Crusaders on the East Coast. I got my first choice. And I think you had to do well. And I think because of the head start that my dad gave me, and the head start that having some flight time ahead of time, and the aeronautical engineering, all of those things, and the model airplanes, let's not forget the model airplanes, I think those gave me a head start, so I did fairly well and got my first choice.
At what point were you pretty certain that you were going to Southeast Asia, that you were going to a real fight?
As soon as I saw orders to F-4 Phantoms, I knew that, and particularly since I was going to the West Coast, we knew that we would be taking part in the Vietnam conflict.
And how did you feel about that?
It wasn't a popular war. Those of us that lived through it at that period of time knew that the country was somewhat torn apart by it, and it wasn't popular here in the U.S., but I had signed on to be a naval officer. And when you sign on to be a naval officer, you're going to receive orders, and you will follow those orders. And so it was something that I knew would most likely occur, although you kept thinking, well, gee, maybe this war will be over soon. Maybe it'll be over right away.
Yeah.
So I wasn't necessarily going after it because I would get to fly in combat, although that was a very challenging form of flying and would develop you in many, many ways as a pilot, as an aviator. But I knew there was a good chance that I'd wind up in Vietnam, and sure enough, I did.
What do you remember about the weapons training that you had to go through to operate the jet fighters?
Well, in the Navy, you got to do that before you got your wings. The Air Force doesn't do that. The Air Force, you basically have learned how to fly a supersonic jet. You've learned how to fly instruments and how to do that very thoroughly. You've learned how to fly in formation and maybe a little bit of tactical maneuvering. But any of your weapons training happens after you get your wings in the Air Force. In the Navy, as a tactical jet pilot, we did air-to-air gunnery. Trying to remember if we did air-to-ground gunnery. I don't think we did any air-to-ground gunnery. But in the A4 Skyhawk, in advanced training, we did bombing. We did practice bombing, and we did air-to-air gunnery. And in fact, we did gunnery in basic training in the T2 jets before you finished basic training, before you went on to advanced training. So I had fired machine guns, I had dropped practice bombs, And of course, all of that changed when I got to the Phantom, because now you're going to do the real thing. So we did use practice bombs to practice achieving the release conditions that you had to arrive at, to have your gun sight be telling you where you were going to hit. But then we actually did drop live 500-pounders going through the training in the F-4 Phantom Squadron.
When you do you remember the date of or do you remember your first mission, and how old were you on that day?
My first mission in Vietnam was my first flight with that squadron, because I had completed all my training in the Navy. It's called a Readiness Air Group, or RAG Squadron, and that was at San Diego. That squadron doesn't go deployed, it doesn't go aboard carriers, but you train on how to fly the F-4 Phantom at that squadron. And then I guess I had done well in that training as well, so I was designated what they called a Category Alpha, and that was someone who could replace a pilot on a ship over in the Tonkin Gulf. So I was sent over to the Coral Sea to join Fighter Squadron 111, the Sundowners, as a replacement pilot. And so my first sortie in that squadron was April the 18th of 1972, and it was a combat mission. So that was my first catapult from the aircraft carrier in a Phantom with 3,000 pounds of bombs on board.
Do you remember what you were thinking when before you released from the carrier?
Well, I knew it was a combat mission. It was actually a mission to troops in contact in South Vietnam. So we weren't expecting a MiG threat. We weren't expecting a lot of anti-aircraft artillery, which we call AAA, anti-aircraft artillery. We weren't expecting a whole lot of big guns shooting at us. There's always the small guns shooting at you, AK-47s, things like that. We weren't expecting any of that. I was apprehensive. I was apprehensive in my first combat sortie. And I was probably apprehensive as well because this was the heaviest Phantom I had ever flown. And the Phantom was an interesting airplane to fly from the aircraft carrier, because you went down the catapult and you got to the end of the catapult and you were flat. You were in a flat attitude. And you couldn't rotate until you got clear of the carrier deck. And now you had to get from being flat to 10 degrees pitch angle immediately. If you didn't, you're in the water. And so we went down the catapult at full aft stick.
Wow.
And what happened was, as you got clear of the deck, and the acceleration on the catapult was rapid enough, it was 4 to 4.5 Gs of acceleration, it changed the shape of your eyeballs, and it was difficult to focus your eyes while the catapult was pushing you. And then once the catapult ended, you had about, 30 feet of deck left, and you're busily trying to focus your eyes. And then once you were off the end, you were sitting there at full aft stick, and you watched the attitude gyro, or you watched outside, and as soon as you saw it start to pitch up, you had to be ready to go to almost full forward stick to stop the pitch rate at 10 degrees.
At 10 degrees.
But you had to get to 10 degrees. Now, you could over-rotate. That wouldn't generally be fatal, although there have been accidents where somebody over-rotated to 25 degrees high and the airplane stalled and rolled, and that would not be a fun day.
Right.
But you had to get to that 10 degrees because you're not going to fly away. You're going to be right into the water if you didn't get to that attitude. And so at night, it seemed like I had a tendency to over-rotate because you wanted to get away from that nasty dark-colored ocean.
Yeah.
And like I say, you could survive a little bit of an over-rotation. You could not survive an under-rotation.
By 1972, there were pilots over there who had some experience in the theater and in those missions. Do you remember anyone in particular trying to give you advice as a new replacement pilot, or saying, here's the thing to making it, to surviving over here? Was there any of that kind of help?
Yes, all of them. All of the above, yeah, all of the above. Well, I remember very vividly the squadron commanding officer, Bob Pearl, the executive officer, Bob Rice. We had a very experienced group of people over there, and of course the Vietnam War had cranked up in about 1964, so by 1972 you had a whole squadron full of experienced aviators. Now, I joined the carrier halfway through that cruise, so all the other pilots in the squadron had experience in combat, and I didn't. But one of the really experienced pilots was one of the pilots that helped found the Navy's Top Gun school. Jim Rulifson was the operations officer when I got to the squadron. I'm sorry, wait, he wasn't. He was the maintenance officer when I first joined the squadron, and then very shortly after that he became the operations officer. But the ops officer at the time as well was a very experienced, he had flown F-8s previously, Dave Coles, and he was now the ops officer in this F-4 Phantom squadron. He's the one that caused me to get the nickname Hoot, by the way, because when I first joined the squadron, I was a 25-year-old kid. Now, I was experienced. I had flown the F-4 Phantom in training and been through Navy pilot training. But the way I like to tell the story is that he said, "Okay, kid, you got a nickname?" He didn't call me kid, but he said, "Okay, well, do you have a nickname?" And my real name is Robert, so I said, "Oh, yes, sir, it's Bob." And he said, "No, come on, I mean a real nickname." And I said, "Well, occasionally in the past I've been called Hoot." And of course, that came from the movie star cowboy, Hoot Gibson. So if your last name's Gibson, you're going to get Hoot for a nickname. My dad told me that he, when he was in the Army Air Corps, had picked up the nickname Hoot. And so that's when I got the nickname Hoot. And that went on my name tag on my flight suit. That went on the side of my cockpit, my canopy in the F-4 Phantom. That went on my coffee cup. So that was April of '72. I changed from being Bob Gibson to being Hoot Gibson.
There are people in aviation, well, there's people all around the world who have known you for years that might struggle to know your real first name.
It's true. My dad went to a test pilot symposium, and this was when I was brand new in the F-14 Tomcat. And the Tomcat was brand new because I was in the first squadron. I was in the Navy's first Tomcat squadron. And two of our air crews, it was probably a pilot and a RIO, a radar intercept officer, a backseater in the Tomcat, went to the Society of Experimental Test Pilots Symposium, and my dad was a member of that. And so after their talk, they talked about the F-14 Tomcat, this brand new jet fighter that the Navy was getting. And my dad walked up to them after their talk, and he said, "Hey, how do you do? I'm Paul Gibson. My son's a pilot in your squadron." And they said, "Really? Who's that?" And he said, "Bob Gibson." And they looked at him and they said, Bob Gibson, we don't have, oh, you mean Hoot." So, yes, most of the world didn't know me as Hoot for quite a few years.
When you docked with Mir, did the Russians say hello, Hoot?
Yes. Now, it was interesting. Sometimes in the different languages, Hoot doesn't come across as Hoot. I remember when I flew a shuttle mission with the Japanese. I flew a joint mission with Japan. One of the Japanese astronauts that we were training couldn't say Hoot, so it was Hoot. It was Hoot. So, and I'm trying to think. I think the Russians were able to pronounce it. Hoot, or Hoot rather.
And then did you have to get into an explanation of old-time Western movies? Probably not.
Well, over the years, since I'm old enough, of course, I knew about Hoot Gibson, the movie star cowboy. But nowadays, oh golly, none of our young people have ever heard anything about someone named Hoot Gibson who was a cowboy. So I'm always explaining. Yeah, he was a movie star cowboy.
Hi, my name is Lieutenant Commander John Allison, Blue Angel number 5 and lead solo pilot for the United States Navy Blue Angels. My dad had a small airplane, and it just got me very, very interested in it. You know, obviously he would let me fly a little bit, and I just liked it. I was attracted to it from the start. Started taking some lessons from him. He was an instructor. I just loved it, absolutely loved it. I got my pilot's license before my driver's license, actually. What's impressed me the most about this team is that the level of teamwork, the level of professionalism basically eclipses anything that I've ever seen. These guys are great. For me, it's a little slice of America. But I feel that anybody can do this. It doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter what your background. If this is what you want to do, you can do it. And that's why I fly airplanes. That's why I fly for the Navy, and that's why I do what I do. Because if one kid walks away from this show thinking that he can do something he didn't think was possible, then we did our jobs.
The Blue Angels have been around since 1946. 61 years ago, Admiral Chester Nimitz knew that the Army Air Corps was becoming the Air Force, and he wanted to make sure that Congress kept spending for naval aviation. Therefore, he tapped on the shoulder of a young lieutenant commander, a war hero, a fighter ace by the name of Roy Butch Boris. And back then, he started the Navy Flight Demonstration Squadron that we now call the Blue Angels. Another thing that most people don't know about the Blue Angels in our demonstration is the fact that we do not fly with G-suits. The G-suits are kind of like the blood pressure cuff that you get at the doctor's office, except it's around your calves, your thighs, and your midsection to help you fight the Gs. The computers help you think along with the jet. So as Gs are pulled, that blood is kept up in your upper half of your body closest to your brain. So the reason why we don't wear G-suits is very, very simple. If you're dogfighting, it's very unpredictable. There's a lot of heavy G loads, and you just can't process that information fast enough. So the computers on board the jet will inflate and deflate your G-suit to help you along in that process of dogfighting. On the other hand, our demonstration is very, very finely choreographed. It's the same maneuvers. It's on that roller coaster track. The same demonstration that we do week in and week out becomes very familiar to the pilots. So they know the onset of G is coming. They know how to fight it, and they're working well in advance of the maneuvers. The problem is with the stick right between their legs, they use their arm as a fulcrum on their thigh, and there's a 40-pound spring on that jet for inverted flight. So it's like sitting in a chair in your room with the 40-pound dumbbell doing this for 48 minutes. That tends to take a lot of energy out of your arm. So to compensate, they use their thigh as a fulcrum. When they do that, if they had G-suits on, the bladders would inflate and deflate as they were taking G, which could cause PIO, or pilot-induced oscillation. So the stick could be bumped by their wrist, which is bumped by the air bladders. And that is actually less safe than flying without the G-suits in the first place.
I came to flying late in life. To me, the the lessons, the life lessons that one learns when you accept the responsibility of piloting aircraft are the most valuable lessons. It was work. It was, it's amazing, an amazing experience.
I think it's really important for everybody to understand that the average F-18 squadron has about a dozen jets and about 250 to 260 people. The Blue Angels have about a dozen jets, but we also have a C-130. We have 110 people. And when we go on the road, we take about 7 jets with us, depending on the show site. We also take Fat Albert. And oh, by the way, we have the oldest F-18s in the Navy and Marine Corps, and we only take about 50 enlisted personnel with us. So for every hour that a jet flies, we can expect somewhere around 20 to 25 man-hours of work to go into this jet to make sure that it's ready for the following air show. In some cases, we may need parts, and Fat Albert may have to go make a late run. But by and large, the next day, you can expect a full lineup of jets. And a testament to our troops and what they've done. In 61 years, we've never had to cancel an air show due to maintenance inavailability of our aircraft.
In aviation, and he's facilitated some things and taken me up in his jet, and he says he's going to give me a ride in his P-51, but he's taught me a lot flying along. I don't know if you've ever flown with Jack, but he's a heck of a teacher, and you know, he'll only tell you once, and then he'll yell at you when you forget, but he makes an impression, and he's a great guy and a great aviator. the flight we just took was unbelievable. It's unbelievable. I just can't describe it. You know, the whole event's amazing. It's an amazing aircraft, and the things that Kojak, Kevin there could do with it were pretty spectacular. He almost got me unconscious. He got me to the point where I didn't care. That was pretty close.